I'm going to try and do my best to give you just some insight as to what the book is about, and to help you aid you in your preparation of reflections on the texts that have been identified in the lectionary. But even before I begin, one thing that I request all of you to do, which I'm not able to do in depth in this presentation, is to actually familiarize yourself with the history of Israel from late 7th century on until the period of the exile. Any good history book, I will send a list of resources that Craig will then distribute to you, but just to familiarize yourself with the historical background or the historical context in which Jeremiah the prophet was exercising his call is very significant and important for us to become aware of in order to understand his prophecies, both words of judgment and words of salvation as well. So that is something I'm setting you to do, almost like homework, as you prepare to lead in worship and reflections on this particular text. Okay. Okay, can you see this all right? Yes? Okay, thank you. Okay. Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 1 tells us that Jeremiah was the son of Hilkiah of the priests who were in Anathoth. And Anathoth is a town about 3 miles northeast of Jerusalem. So he comes from Judah, from the vicinity of Jerusalem. And we are told that he began to prophesy in the 13th year of Josiah, circa 627 BCE. Now, the date of when he actually began to prophesy is something that is debated in scholarship, but it is generally assumed around the time or towards the end of Josiah's reign, but in the last several decades leading up to the exile. The text in chapter 1 verse 6 says that Jeremiah was young. Now, we don't know exactly how young, but some scholars believe that this date actually refers to his birth, when he was called from the womb, as it says in chapter 1, verse 5. Majority of the scholars, though, as I said earlier, see 627 BCE as the beginning of his actual ministry. And he continued to prophesy until the fall of Jerusalem, or the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. But he really does not disappear until around 582 BCE. The fall of Jerusalem is 587, 86, and he continues. We continue to hear about him until about 582 BCE. That is 4 years after. So the length of his prophetic activity has been calculated around 45 years in all, which is a fairly long time. And he's best known to us as a person because of the way he reports his own reflections and also reports them to his scribe Baruch, who also is ascribed to have recorded some of the events in Jeremiah's life. Now, through these autobiographical, that is the words as recorded by Baruch, his disciple or his scribe, and his biographical reports, the prophet has earned a reputation as the mournful prophet, the sorrowful prophet. And because he expresses his grief without any reserve, and he expresses his anguish as the servant of God for the nation and for the people of Judah. And we see a side to the prophets that is rarely seen. You don't really see this as much in the other prophetic books, and that is this rather emotionally powerful feelings that Jeremiah gives expression to, that go alongside the zeal or the enthusiasm and the commitment and the loyalty that he has for God's word. So it is not an distanced, unemotional kind of involvement in his ministry, but it was one where he, in a way, felt deeply what was happening to his nation. And so in a way, he embodied quite strongly and significantly his zeal, not for his people, his love for his people, and his love for God, and the spread of God's word. Unfortunately, when you read through the book as a whole, you notice that there is little good news to report to his audience of that time, because of the hegemony of Babylon at that time. So we are talking about the time period when Assyria had already fallen to the Babylonians, and Babylon is now is controlling Judah. So Judah is a vassal of Babylon, but yet Judah was allowed to continue to have its own leadership. But under the and as things, as you know, as time progressed in those first few years before the exile, you notice that the leadership was trying to subdue Babylon by forging alliances either with Egypt, mostly with Egypt, and Babylon then therefore struck Jerusalem and destroyed it completely in 587 BCE. But the prophet Jeremiah at that time was already announcing impending doom and expulsion from the land of Judah. But at the same time, he also was hopeful because he looked beyond the exile to the day when God would continue to be with God's people, but in a new covenantal relationship. So this work reveals more about Jeremiah, the individual, than any other prophetic book. So you can read the book of Isaiah or Ezekiel or Amos or Hosea, and you do not learn as much about the individual prophet as you would when you read the book of Jeremiah. So he's considered to be a man who was born out of his due time, a person in ancient dress, with whom modern readers can readily identify. And I hope that if you do an active reading of the book, you will also be able to identify with both the person Jeremiah, but also with what he says in the book. Jeremiah has been classified as a messenger of hope in the midst of crisis. And that is because the era in which he was prophesying, as I've already alluded to, was a time of very intense crisis for the people of Judah. William Holiday, in his book Jeremiah, Spokesman Out of Time, written in the 1970s, identifies Jeremiah as a spokesman out of time. And he says, although Jeremiah is grounded in a very particular and unique historical situation, he speaks in a more special and direct way than he did to his own time. So he speaks to us in this special and direct way than he did to his own time, says Holiday. So, in a way, it's very challenging that Holiday says this, but if you do a very careful reading of the book, you will notice that it is, it is not too hard to garner support for this contention. In other words, much of what Holiday said in 1974 applies, is discernible within the book of Jeremiah, and we might arrive at the same conclusion. So the language of Jeremiah as a whole is rather coarse. It's violent because he's speaking in violent times. It's quite alarming as well, with penetrating images of cultural ruin, emotional malaise, symbolic disease. And these resonate in a world where optimism seems to have replaced ambiguity. Um, um, so therefore, it is I hope I have not dissuaded you already from looking at this book because of the way in which it has been characterized, but I hope it has engendered some curiosity, at least, that you would continue to look, that you would look at the book. So it contains rather horrifying accounts of death and destruction in the form of siege, military occupation, forced relocation, and most of these issues are not ancient issues. They are very much issues of today, and like what we might encounter if, when we listen to the news every morning. So so he testifies to the breakdown or to the complete collapse of meaning and civility and the crumbling of social systems and venerable institutions like the temple. And all of these sound remarkably familiar. I think we do also live in a world where not everything is working well. We are surrounded by violence and by antisocial and uncivil behavior. Systems are breaking down. So cultural institutions are breaking down. The church is losing its esteemed place within society. I mean, you might disagree with me, but I'm just saying this is how I'm characterizing the world today in the light of Jeremiah. So you have issues such as nations and countries and cities in crisis, national debt, preemptive military strikes and doctrines that destabilize large regions, erode international morale, that erode international morale and morality, developments in technologies that are leading to alienation and dehumanization, consumerist values, immigration policies and legislations that are rooted in xenophobia and garbed in evangelical piety, depletion of natural and cultural resources, ubiquitous violence, torture, systematic killing of civilians, human trafficking, exploitation of children, nuclear, biological, chemical terrorism. You might say not all of these apply to the Australian context, but I think many do. Maybe not all, but many do. And you can decide which of those are relevant for or issues that characterize Australia today. So therefore, many of these haunting scenarios and poignant utterances ring true today, depending on which part of the world you're reading this text from, of course. But taken in totality, the book is a literary artifact of terror, as one scholar calls it. It's an artifact of terror, a disturbing cultural expression of both lament and chaos. So there's chaos and there's lament. And there's terror. So it's an artifact that enshrines these realities. There's danger, disjunction, and distress, and all of these bubble beneath the surface of virtually every passage that we read: denial, despair, defiance. And so when you are reading this text, and I say active reading, that is you are paying close attention to the language of the text, we as readers find ourselves at the edge of time. So therefore, some scholars would categorize the fact or the notion that Jeremiah, in a way, is eschatological because it addresses people who are dispossessed, people who have suffered unimaginable loss and suffering, and they are trying to eke out a living at the margins of empire. As I've said earlier, the book, because it is written in the context of war and chaos and confusion, suffering and pain and violence, the book has been identified as war literature because it speaks of annihilated worlds, shattered communities, collapse of cherished institutions and understandings of life. And in a way, the book is therefore located in a liminal space between total destruction and looking towards the future. So it is neither here nor there. It contains language that throbs with pain and staggers in confusion and rages in disappointment. As I've mentioned, alluded to already, the text exudes raw emotion on the part of the prophet, who gives speech to the disaster, but at the same time, the prophet does not evade his responsibility as a prophet to provide a theological response to the stimuli around him. That is the crisis and the chaos around him. He attempts to offer a theological, or not attempts, he does offer a theological response. Now, the whole book can be identified as one that adopts a judgment salvation scheme or schema, but within this schema of both judgment of the nation, judgment of Judah, judgment of the nations or Babylon, and salvation of the people of Judah, you also have multiple voices, other voices and counter voices, all of them trying to make sense of what is happening to them and around them. Okay. Within the book, therefore, you have a tapestry of hope articulated for people who have been displaced, because we're talking about an exilic audience. Hope to survive in a world where there is irrationality, violence, and loss. And all of these are far more tangible than moral coherence and meaning. So, you can think about going to Syria today or to Ukraine and sitting in the midst of those ruins, and you tell people, all is going to be well. Well, it's so hard for them to accept that as news in the midst of what they are experiencing and what they can see around them. Am I building a picture for you here? Yes, I hope. So it is trying to give hope to a people in the midst of such deep and absolute suffering and pain, and all that they can experience is that pain. To give them hope is a very, very challenging task. So in a way, Jeremiah therefore is a book that is seeking to find meaning in a world and events that defy ordinary categories of explanation. Okay. Events that are beyond communal recognition. So the book, as has been categorized by some scholars, is a two-part drama with Jeremiah and Yahweh, and of course, the kings and other priests and prophets as actors as well. But the principal actors are Jeremiah and Yahweh. And the book can be divided, therefore, into two parts, chapters 1 to 25, which actually is narrates or describes and wrestles with the collapse of Judah, which was once a stable and reliable nation. So the first 25 chapters pay attention to this collapse, and there you have a lot of critique. A lot of the nation of Judah, of its people, of its leadership, of its institutions and cultural systems, and judgment proclaimed as well against all these people and forces. In the second part of the book, verses chapters 26 to 55, is the survival script. Okay, how do we then therefore respond to what is happening to us? Where is God? Where are we? How do we repair this breach that has occurred between God and us? And how do we, find or eke out a life in the midst of this collapse, in the midst of this chaos, and in the face of social and religious mayhem? So in Act 1, that is in chapters 1 to 25, you will find that Jeremiah attacks all the sort of venerable institutions of Judah's faith. So nothing misses his attention. He attacks the temple and its systems of worship, particularly in chapter 7, their covenantal arrangements in chapter 11, the insider privileges, particularly of the haves, the elite, the rich, and the powerful in chapter 18, as well as the ancestral land claims and the Davidic dynasty. So there were the elite who or the people who saw themselves as the progeny of the Davidic dynasty, and were trying to articulate, or not just articulate, but implement a sense of entitlement. This is our land, and we can do what we want, and we can take over. So all of this is being questioned in the first 25 chapters, and he, as Yahweh's spokesperson, he meaning Jeremiah, he deconstructs these defining beliefs and institutions which served as bulwarks against danger both inside and outside. So, for example, the continued resilience and survival of the Davidic dynasty. The Davidic dynasty can never be dismantled, was what the people believed in. Or Zion, the temple as the abode and the dwelling of Yahweh, can never be destroyed. So these people, were in a way desensitized to the ethical demands of their faith, to the dangers of the political alliances they were forging, because they were completely enamored or rooted or submerged in this notion that nothing can touch us. Nothing will happen to us. We are fine. Our nation is fine. Our land is fine. Our temples are fine, etc. Nothing can be destroyed. And so all of these defining beliefs and institutions are being challenged by Jeremiah, who insists that the securities of the old world will not save Judah from either loss or destruction. So he says that so once he has dashed all these hopes in the old world, in the old institutions, the Act 2 begins. Act 2 of the book begins, where he demonstrates to the readers of that time, namely the Jewish refugees in Babylon, we think that they will survive this dismantling of their once stable future and culture. One stable culture. So I think what is important to acknowledge here is the fact that these people may have felt particularly vulnerable because everything that they had held dear as indestructible is now destroyed. Okay, so there was nothing they could latch on to, and here was therefore a prophet trying to tell them, yes, all of these had to go, all of these had to die. And they are dead now, but you will survive. You will survive despite what has happened. And it is not the end of the line for Judah because you are in exile or your land has been taken over. Oops, what have I done? Sorry. Yeah. So amidst the horrors of war and the emotional scars and the symbolic debris, amid all this devastation, Jeremiah emerges as the prophet of hope, and he announces the advent of God's program of building and planting, which is kind of one of his mottos that you will find in chapter 1, verse 10. As we see through this second part of the book of Jeremiah, particularly in chapters 27 to 29, Jeremiah, as I have already mentioned, counters the leaders of the establishment and their optimism, grounded in this inviolability of Zion, and argues that authentic hope must bear the scars of disaster and embrace the harsh realities of the shattered world. So if you are going to become a prophet of hope, if this hope that you are trying to impart to your audience is authentic, it must also pay attention to the disaster and bear the scars of that disaster and embrace the harsh realities of the shattered world. In a way, reading this statement might remind you of the wounds of Christ. You know, where are the wounds of the church? Where are the wounds of Christ in our own lives? So he's adamant that returning to the past is no longer possible, and he outlines God's fresh initiative that the refugees will survive the war and the pain, and without the old support systems. You know, despite the shattering of the old support system, they will survive. And so he writes a letter to the exiles in chapter 29, which we will look at a little later. So exiles will be bound by the memory of the suffering and the experience of dislocation, but they will also be mindful of God's gracious acts of salvation. So they are not going to be stuck in that position of pain and suffering. They will be liberated, they will be transformed, but at the same time, they are not going to completely forget what they have been through. And that memory is important, is an important reminder throughout their existence. And then in chapters 34 on, you have a few instances of sort of a downward slide. The landowners go back on their covenant obligation to the poor, and you have, the burning of the prophetic scroll that Jeremiah very painstakingly, voiced. He dictated to his scribe Baruch, and Baruch writes up the scroll describing Jeremiah's life and his prophecies. And of course, others come to know about the scroll, and Jeremiah and Baruch are exposed, and the scroll is burnt by Jehoiakim. And this sets in motion a series of shocking events, because what Jeremiah is prophesying is not what the people or the leadership of that time wanted to hear. It was too counter to all the tradition that they are now immersed in, and so therefore the message that Jeremiah was imparting was scary, was disconcerting, was in a way shaking the establishment and the status quo, and so they needed to shut him down. And so the scroll is burnt. Jeremiah is thrown into prison. Later, he's thrown into a cistern, but then he's freed by a group of Judahites. And this during this time also, the Gedaliah, who was a leader, put in position of power by the Babylonian leaders, was assassinated, and so all these chapters from 34 onwards describe these various events. So therefore, it was a time of civil war. So there was, yes, empire, imperialism, and colonization by the Babylonians, but there was also civil strife, movements, that were wanting to resist, movements that were saying we should not resist, along with Jeremiah. So there was civil war, there were coups, there were massacres and duplicity. All of these saturate the landscape of Judah, and Jeremiah has to escape to Egypt in 582 BCE. But yet modest signs of hope are visible in the fact that Jeremiah survives despite attempts made on his life, and his life is spared, and God's voice continues to be heard. So God's voice is not buried or subdued. So faithful supporters come to his aid, and he is rescued. But then they are not able to stop the siege of Jerusalem, described in chapter 39 under Nebuchadnezzar in 582 BCE. So the courage of these faithful few saved Jeremiah, who now, in a way, symbolizes the war-torn people of God, because he endures personal assaults, national devastation, and he heralds the downfall of Babylon and the liberation of the long-suffering nation in chapters 50 to 51. And the performance ends in chapters 52, where there is a rather ambiguous vignette in which Judah's captive Jehoiakim, not Kim, but Kin, is released from prison. That means, you see, in 587, when the nation fell, the king was taken into exile and imprisoned along with his entourage. And now we are told that he was released from prison and was afforded a place of honor at the royal place in Babylon. There's no historical proof for this. That he was released, yes, but whether he was offered a place of honor at the royal palace, not place, but royal palace, is questionable. So this cryptic allusion to this release of Jehoiakim signals the restoration of the Davidic dynasty, or more broadly, God's continuing work among the Judean refugees in Babylon. So, so that is the kind of an overarching introduction to the book in snippet form of the first 25 chapters and the last 27 chapters. But the book begins with this call of Jerusalem in chapter 1, and I'd like you to pay attention to verse 10. Today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. And this is part of the call that is issued to Jeremiah right when he was still very young. He was too young to speak, he says, but anyway, he has been called and has been commissioned and is being sent with the assurance that God will be with him and God will rescue him, and God then prepares him for the issuance of his prophecy, and the words are that he has been appointed over nations and kingdom to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Now, this drama is based on this two-hinged wooden panels. I had to look up to make sure that I understood the word diptych right. The plucking and the pulling down, and on the other, the building and the planting. Now, these two phrases are rather key to understanding Jeremiah as a whole. We often might read the plucking and the pulling down as the judgment, and the building and the planting as the salvation. And we think that maybe the first 25 chapters are all about plucking and pulling down, and the last 27 chapters are about building and planting. And we associate judgment with divine wrath and salvation with divine love. But I think this is a rather reductionist view. While, yes, in terms of genre, we might identify them as judgment and salvation, in terms of interpretation, it might be unhelpful to completely distinguish between or separate between the two, because the two are not mutually exclusive in Jeremiah's formulation of hope. And I'd like you to remember this, that the first makes healing and survival possible. That is the judgment by looking at massive loss straight in the face or in the eye, and breaking various forms of denial. And the second moves beyond denial and despair to meaning-making constructions. Okay, so this motto that you find in verse 10 is not a dualistic formula that separates or divorces plucking and pulling down from building and planting, but rather it is language that belongs together and translates into an anatomy of hope in crisis. In order to, there will be times where you need to pluck and pull down, and then you need to build and plant. And in order to build and plant, you will need to perhaps pluck and pull down. Making sense? Okay. So meaning-making arrangements are what Jeremiah is offering, a taxonomy of hope, both for exiles of old and those who are on pilgrimage today. Okay, we have 10 minutes, and I just, I think if you are going to be looking at Jeremiah 1, which is part of our lectionary reading, I'd like you to, I think we should keep that in mind rather carefully, that we don't think of judgment, separate judgment and salvation, but see how they actually work together for the good of the people. Another major theme that I think stood out for me by looking at these lectionary readings, particularly in chapter 2 and chapter 4, I think it was, Yes, the prophet engages in some truth telling. Okay, the prophet names and breaks a surplus of deceptions. He critiques social structures and assumptions of and prevailing values, and therefore he refuses, not sorry, refuses. He refuses to anesthetize the community to its true condition. And I think, I mean, I remember, if I may digress for a minute here, you know, even in India, while I was working there, some people expressing displeasure about when hearing a sermon that would unpack or bring to their attention the issues of injustice or violation or abuse. Oh, we have come here to church in order to feel good and to be comforted. We don't want to be reminded of all the pain in the world. Okay, but here you notice that the prophet engages in some rather harsh truth telling, and he doesn't he doesn't hesitate to unpacking the true condition of the nation. And therefore, he seems to put the nation under a microscope, and he sees that it's a world beyond repair. Its ideological and institutional mainstay will do little to rectify its condition. So he speaks truth to its power brokers, namely the prophets, the priests, and the kings. So the leadership is not absolved of what is happening. The leadership is called to attention and to responsibility. And so, in chapter 8, which again is part of our lectionary, he says, they dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say. So therefore, he calls attention to the fact that if we don't question systems of power, systems of abuse that are marginalizing people and are creating discomfort for people, then in a way we are just dressing the wounds of the people, by saying peace, peace. And therefore, I think there's a very strong and perhaps a challenging call here for those of us who are in positions of leadership, either within the church or outside, under whose care there are communities of people. And I think we have not been called only to make the people feel good, but also to rouse the people into action, to address the wounds of the world. So the prophetic critique is not confined to those in power alone. He also exposes spiritual and moral bankruptcy of the shareholders as well. So Jeremiah 2 and Jeremiah 4, both of which are on the lectionary, are good examples where he calls attention to the people themselves, not just the priests, but also ordinary people, particularly in language such as that they have followed worthless idols, they become worthless themselves. So the whole community is being addressed in these charges that he makes, not just against the priests and the false prophets and the kings, but also the descendants of Jacob and the clans of Israel. Also So then another text in the lectionary is chapter 8. Here are words of hope. He's articulating words of hope through the wreckage amidst which the people have found themselves. And I guess one of the ways in which he expresses hope is to actually feel what the people are feeling and to lament alongside them. So at the site of ground zero, Jeremiah gives in to tears of lament. And so in verse 21, he says, since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn and horror grips me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? So in a sense, he also experiences the hopelessness of the people themselves, okay? And is looking for signs of healing, for signs of hope for medicine that would ease the pain and that would ease the suffering of his people, and questions, therefore, is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king no longer there? Where is God? Because God is the comforter. God is the comforter, and God is not visible. God is not, he's not able to tangibly experience the presence of God. And I think this is an emotion that many of us would be familiar with, especially if you have been through moments of crisis, either personal or professional or communal. And so he says in chapter 9, verse 1, my head, oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. And we are living in a world today where death and violence is become passé. We hear about it every day on the television, and we think of it as a piece of news, and we move on to another channel. It challenges me as well. So anyway, so that is in chapter 2 and chapter 4, and then in chapter 8, how do we express our solidarity with people who are in the midst of pain and suffering. Chapter 31 is another text again that appears in the lectionary, and here are strong words of hope, where Jeremiah is assuring the exiles that they will return to their land, that they are in exile at the moment, but they will return. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will plant the kingdoms of Israel and Judah with the offspring of people and of animals. So it's not just the human world, but also the creation, the animal world will be restored to the land to which it belongs. So and so therefore, while God watched as they were being torn down and uprooted and overthrown and destroyed, God will watch them again, will be with them, will accompany them as they build and plant. And so they will no longer say, they will no longer feel the pain of what they had experienced. They will make a new covenant with the people of Israel. So in this particular text, I think what is significant is also the fact that the law or the covenantal relationship is no longer in the minds, but it is one that is written on the hearts, and people will know that God is Yahweh is their God, and they are God's people. And so this particular text is one in which this hope that is being given expression to, it's real. It takes seriously the plight of the captured community, while also affirming that it will survive and eventually thrive. And this hopeful pragmatism is indicative of the prophet's acknowledgement of the suffering of the exilic community. So in other words, what we are learning here is that you cannot talk about hope without also paying attention to the pain and the suffering. So Craig, I'm running out of time. It's already 11 o'clock. Could I have 2 more minutes? Okay.
That's a yes.
Yes, okay. So the hope is founded not only on the repentance of the people, but is also rooted in the bountiful mercy and grace of God. So Jeremiah 31, that in a way informs us and confirms for us that God is present with us in both the thick and the thin of pain and suffering, and in the disturbing questions that suffering actually gives rise to. And God is always watching, but a day will come when God, out of God's grace and mercy, will provide community with all that is needed to overcome its pain. And then there's a word about forgiveness as well at the end of that text, which is another theme. And what does forgiveness mean in the context of this kind of a crisis? And it's not simply a wiping out of a wrong or denying memory, and neither is it acquitting a wrongdoer. It is an active, willed, and conscious change of heart that succeeds in overcoming naturally felt feelings of anger, resentment, vengeance, and hatred. So forgiveness is a gift. What does that mean? I think you you may want to think about that. Chapter 23 is another text in the lectionary, and in this particular text, what is being emphasized is the fact that the shepherd king Yahweh will gather the scattered flock and protect it from harm. So therefore, what the text is calling for is the fact that, yes, in order to impart hope, you have to remember the pain. But in order to for the hope to be acceptable, you also have to talk about the future. Okay, a better life and a future. So generating hope involves more than just truth telling and deconstruction, emotional integrity and candor, engagement and disputation. Hope also imagines a future where none seems possible. And so in Jeremiah chapter 29, which is a letter to the exiles, the word hope is mentioned. It's a primary reference to the Hebrew word tikva, and it refers to the future of the displaced community. So God's harbinger of hope here, the prophet, asserts that the collapse of Judah's universe signals neither the end of faith nor the death of the community. God is still at work, mending a broken world and healing lives. Now, chapter 29, in order, you embrace the fact that God is working, God continues to work, God is mending, and therefore, what do people have to do for those of them who are in exile? So chapter 29 is a letter written to this community, and basically what the letter is arguing for is that, yes, you are in exile, accept it, but this is not forever. It is for perhaps a short period of time, or not short because it ended up being 70 years or more for others. But in any case, while you are there, you need to work for your well-being and that of their new location. So if you are in exile, you need to take care of yourself, and you need to also work for the well-being of the place in which you have been exiled to. So therefore, the letter to the exile is one in which it says, okay, don't sit back and think, okay, I'm going to do nothing. God is going to take me out of here sometime. No, you will have to work. You will have to work for your liberation. So if you don't do either of this, your suffering will continue. So you need to create a viable community or a viable communal life in faraway places. So rather than clinging to old identities, the refugees are urged to accept their new place on the margins of society. This is a rather revolutionary text and may receive different interpretations, particularly if you have been a migrant or a refugee who has been forced to flee your motherland. Yes, it would be interesting to have people from those particular contexts to reflect on this text. So in conclusion, I would say that the book of Jeremiah is an artifact of hope, but it's also an artifact of terror. It doesn't placate, nor does it pacify. It does not traffic in entitlements. It talks about hope that is dangerous, that is disruptive, that is disturbing. It subverts long-held beliefs and social structures, but it does not evade or avert its gaze from hypocrisy and injustice, and it demands wholehearted disobedience. And it talks about the future of the hope that is desired, and this future of the hope requires that we work towards engendering this hope and have it made acceptable. There are few assurances of victory in the book, and even fewer exemptions from suffering. So in other words, what it does assure is survival. Survival is nothing that we can ridicule, particularly during times of war. So therefore, what the book is calling for is an evaluation, an analysis of all our religious categories, geopolitical systems, to see whether they are functioning well, and if they are not functioning, what is wrong? I mean, are those the places where we find hope and God's blessings today? So, but what the book is here affirming is the fact that God's place is among the broken, the dispossessed, and the imprisoned, the abused, the violated, and the conquered. And so hope is to be found among the vulnerable and the wounded. And therefore, it is unmasking all illusions of power and reveals God's solidarity with those who are exiled, quote unquote, both then, during that time, and now. Yeah, thank you.